The following presentation is a teaching by Avraham Emunah. Daniel chapter 12 presents a prophetic timeline for the abomination causing desolation to be completed in the year 2027. I've been studying the book of Daniel for over 2 decades, and it still captivates me, as I'm sure it does many theologians and lay people alike, with its complex prophecies and visions, many of which have been interpreted as predictions concerning both historical and future events. One of the most intriguing passages for me personally comes in Daniel chapter 12 verses 11 to 12, which reads, "From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days." This prophecy outlines a span of time beginning with the end of sacrifices and the setting up of an abomination that causes desolation, a mute or silent idol, as it's described in the original Hebrew. I interpret this silent abomination as a structure that would symbolize a disruption or obstruction of the temple's role in Jewish worship. My hypothesis suggests that this prophecy may actually point to the construction of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in 692 CE, and potentially a future date in 2027 as the year when Jews might regain full access to the Temple Mount. In this video, I will break down the potential fulfillment of this prophecy by analyzing the historical context, the significance of key dates, and what the numbers in Daniel may signify. The Hebrew word used for abomination often signifies an idol, a figure or structure that embodies false worship or disrupts Jewish worship. The term mute abomination is in the original Hebrew and is found translated as such in the Jewish Tanakh in verse 11. The mute abomination interpretation is that of an object or structure in the place of the temple which is lacking divine essence. Thus, it is silent. This aligns well with the structure of the Dome of the Rock, which silently sits there on the Temple Mount, blocking Jewish worship. Being built on the Temple Mount, this Islamic structure currently occupies what is traditionally seen as the holiest site in Judaism, the location of the Jewish temple. Thus, from a Jewish perspective, the Dome of the Rock could be seen as a mute idol, an object that desolates the Jewish people, preventing them from proper worship as commanded in the Torah. In prophetic literature, days are often symbolic of years. Taking this approach, I understand 1,290 days in Daniel chapter 12 verse 11 as a reference to 1,290 years. The start of this timeline is marked by the end of the daily sacrifices, an event that aligns historically with the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem. In 598 BCE, Babylonian forces began a prolonged siege against Jerusalem. Supplies into the city were restricted, including sacrificial animals essential for temple worship and conducting the daily sacrifice prescribed in Torah. This situation culminated in the cessation of sacrifices altogether and eventually the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE. From the perspective of Daniel, the moment sacrifices were obstructed, the siege of 598 BCE signified the starting point of his prophecy and when to start the clock's countdown. Keep in mind that the angel mentioned in Daniel chapter 12 is describing to Daniel himself this prophecy, not us. Therefore, it is from Daniel's timeline and view that we must read this prophecy. In Daniel's perspective, when he personally recognized that the temple sacrifices had ceased, would have been the year 598 BCE, when animal sacrifice stopped due to the Babylonian siege. This is then when we must start the prophecy timeline. When we add 1,290 years to this date, 598 BCE, we arrive at 692 CE, precisely the year that the Dome of the Rock was completed on the Temple Mount. This alignment suggests an exact fulfillment date of Daniel's vision. The completion of the Dome of the Rock in 692 CE marked a point in history where a structure foreign to Jewish worship physically and symbolically obstructed access to the Temple Mount, creating what could be understood as an abomination of desolation, a silent abomination or mute structure hindering Jewish worship. The next prophetic timeline. Blessed is the one who waits and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. The prophecy in Daniel chapter 12 doesn't conclude with the 1,290 years, but introduces an additional time span, one of 1,335 years. The verse seems to imply a blessing or positive outcome for those who persevere until the end of this extended period. Calculating 1,335 years from 692 CE. If we start from the year 692 CE, the completion date of the Dome of the Rock, and add 1,335 years, we arrive at the year 2027 CE. This date should stir the hopes of those who believe it marks a prophetic milestone. A time when Jews might finally regain access to the Temple Mount, worshipping not just at the Western Wall but on the Temple Mount itself. The Jewish community's interest in Temple Mount access has steadily increased in recent decades. There is a growing movement within Israel advocating for Jewish prayer rights on the Temple Mount, currently restricted by long-standing policies established after the Six-Day War in 1967. So now perhaps for many, the year 2027 holds prophetic significance as the conclusion of the 1,335-year period mentioned in Daniel. As I interpret this prophecy as foretelling a time when the Jewish people will be able to worship freely on the Temple Mount once more. With ongoing political changes in the region and a shift in public opinion, the possibility of renewed access to the Temple Mount is no longer entirely unimaginable. Jewish leaders and activists are increasingly vocal about their hopes for restored rights on this sacred site, so seeing 2027 as a possible turning point based on Daniel's prophetic timeline is completely reasonable. In my previous video, I showed that the fulfillment of the 2,300-year prophecy from Daniel 8 came to fulfillment in 1967, when the Jews took back sovereign control over Jerusalem. 2027, the year being indicated here in this prophecy, is exactly 60 years after the 1967 prophecy came. What is the significance of the number 60? In Hebrew, the number 60 is represented by the letter Samech. In Hebrew, letters have numerical value. Samech means to support, to sustain, or to strengthen. With that in mind, we can assume that whatever happens exactly 60 years after the year 1967 regarding the Temple Mount is meant to sustain or strengthen something. I'm going to assume this is a reference to God sustaining and strengthening God's covenant with Israel. In 2027, whatever events happen regarding the Temple Mount, it is to sustain and strengthen God's covenant to Israel and to the house of David. The number 60 is also a number that can mean earthly king in numerology. In conclusion, I think the prophecy in Daniel 12 and this particular reading of the 1,290 and 1,335 days as years yields a compelling narrative that aligns with specific historical and potential future events. The alignment of dates from 598 BCE to 692 CE, fulfilling the 1,290 days, and then from 692 CE, when the mute abomination was set up, to 2027 CE, fulfilling the 1,335 days, raises serious questions of whether Daniel's vision was meant to guide expectations about the Temple Mount for the Jewish people. Whether or not 2027 will mark a significant change remains to be seen. But for those who find meaning in the text of Daniel as I have, this prophecy is a reminder of faith and patience, waiting upon divine timing for the restoration of worship on Judaism's holiest site. As we approach this date, the unfolding of events will be watched with anticipation by those who look to Daniel's vision for guidance and hope. Thank you for watching. This has been a presentation of Avraham Emunah. The views expressed here are mine alone and are not meant to be an authoritative representation of any one religious tradition.